Good day, Adam's child. Welcome to this week's short sermon all about possibly the most well-known city in the entire US, New York City, and its obscure and confused condition in the post-war Fallout world. This one is quite the ride, but let's take a deep look at why so many people believe that New York City is completely non-existent, having been blasted straight to Adam, and only existing as a crater or pile of twisted metal, and compare that to what the lore itself actually says. Crank up the rads and let's investigate Fallout's New York City myth. Straight out of the gate, let's state what the long-standing and pervasive myth that has permeated many Fallout discussions for well over a decade actually is, and pretend that all this footage is not Boston, but New York. Even up to now, in the year of our Adam 2024, some people will state or insist that New York City is so absolutely destroyed after the Great War that there's nothing there, making a game set there uninteresting or infeasible. Although there are many ways people will describe this, everything from being obliterated to glassed and sometimes even flooded, the most common of all the refrains is that it is just a giant crater. The thing is, when people are pressed on where they got the information that it is just a giant crater, no one is able to actually find any bit of lore to back that up. That left me and many others wondering, where did this myth come from, and how did it become so pervasive? One of the sources many people will try to cite is that they think they heard it somewhere in the Fallout Bible. The Bible being an old project by Chris Avellone, who worked on some of the early Fallout games, and was an attempt to compile information related to the games with fan input. The Fallout Bible is quite long and a very interesting read. I would recommend it, but nowhere in the dozens and dozens of pages does it state that New York City was reduced to a crater during the Great War, nor does it ever allude to it. The only time New York is called out specifically is when a partial nuclear meltdown occurred in 2065, which disrupted the state's electrical capacity, but didn't blow up or do anything really catastrophic. This electrical disturbance meant less electricity for residential cooling, resulting in what the Bible calls the hot summer. That's it though. So not only is that not even close to what people claim, but the Fallout Bible isn't even canon. So what it says doesn't have any bearing on what is canon now, unless it's referring to events that have actually happened in the early games. So, if the Bible didn't say it, maybe another widely used source for Fallout information is to blame, like a Fallout wiki? Looking through the Nukapedia history for the New York City article from October 2009 to April 2010, one sentence mentioned that the city was probably destroyed like most other major cities. That is a far cry from declaring it an uninhabitable crater, and this line that references the city as probably destroyed was removed from the article after being up for only half a year. Again, in February 2011, it was edited to say that New York City was laid to waste, but this one stayed up less than a month before it was removed in March of that year. Lastly, in 2017, it was once again edited to specifically call New York City a nuclear crater filled with radioactive water, but that edit was reversed only a few hours later. While one may argue that the seeds of this myth could have begun here, the non-specific verbiage of the article, coupled with the short duration that these parts were even in the article, make me really doubt the wiki is to blame for starting the myth. Although it is possible it could have started the ball rolling. So if it wasn't the Bible, and there's no smoking gun in the wikis, perhaps as some people claim, it was a widely propagated myth on early message boards that were popular in the late 90s and 2000s. Forums like Duck and Cover or No Mutants Allowed definitely could have been the origin of such a myth. So with what search functions are available to me, I dove into the oldest posts and worked my way up. I found barely anything in these oldest posts, with Duck and Cover actually not giving me anything related to my myth hunt, except for someone who said Obama would blow up New York City in 2011. So, that's something I guess. No Mutants Allowed had some old posts, but the only thing that got even close to our gold standard here, which again is New York is a radioactive crater, was someone suggesting that New York City would be full of ghouls like Necropolis. and this post was all the way back in 2006 before Fallout 3 had even released. But that's it. Neither of these forums have discussion of New York as being anything close to what we are looking for until the mid and late 2010s, which is also around the time that many other websites also started getting similar posts. So if it was one of these old forums or message boards, that evidence seems to be lost to the ravages of time, at least for now. So a general search for the oldest posts that I could find anywhere that directly mention New York being a crater is actually in February of 2013 over on the Nexus. It is a comment in an article asking where Fallout 4 could take place if it didn't end up being Boston. Spoiler alert, it did. And then what that location would be. The second comment from the top takes a big old dump on the first comment that suggested New York City by confidently claiming that New York is an irradiated crater with absolutely nothing in it. And they say it with such confidence too. How could you not believe that? Now, I don't think this is the first time this was ever written on the internet, nor were the entire myth spawned from. It seems as though this idea is older than this post, but it is also clear that before this point, this topic was not that widely discussed. Otherwise, we would expect some results before 2013 surviving. This general search is actually quite barren for the years before 2013, but one thing is obvious, and that is that the number of people pondering the fate of large, well-known cities like New York City has increased over time as the Fallout franchise grows larger and more well-known amongst the general populace. And maybe that seems obvious, but I'm going to do due diligence and back up my claims with evidence. This is where they'd put their source, if they had one. Plugging in Fallout New York into Google Trends from 2004 to the present yields an interesting graph. Except for some small bumps, the graph is essentially flat for most of the 2000s, with minimal interest, but interestingly, these bumps correspond to when the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion was released in March of 2006, and a writer for GameSpot noted that the game's release piqued people's interest in Bethesda's Fallout 3 project that had been announced in 2004. There is a chance that discussion during these years could be the genesis of our myth. Fallout 3 released on October 28, 2008, which corresponds nicely with this small spike, which elevated interest in a game set in New York to levels that have remained constant to the present day. Each of these spikes actually corresponds to a significant event within the series, with jumps when Fallout New Vegas was released, Fallout 4 was released, Fallout 76, although that one's a good deal smaller, and finally, the Fallout TV show. The peaks grew from Fallout 3 to Fallout New Vegas, and finally Fallout 4, where it hit its all-time high. But the spikes were smaller for 76 and the Fallout TV show. The background frequency between these spikes, while not showing a general trend up or down, certainly show much more activity than before Fallout 3 was released. To see if Fallout New York was a unique pattern here, I added two other large and well-known cities, Chicago, which followed a similar pattern, and Detroit, which is also more or less the same. This graph seems to indicate that when a new game or even a TV show comes out and increases Fallout's exposure in the public eye, new fans invariably end up searching the fate of their home city or state in the Fallout universe, as well as popular and well-known places. New York seems to rank near the top of such searches, but it's certainly clear that since the release of Fallout 3, people searching for information related to New York City increased dramatically. The question is, did the germ of this myth get its start prior to the release of Fallout 3, where we have next to no results for even the oldest fan forums, and that, according to Google Trends, had scant few searches, or did it start to take shape as more people were exposed to the franchise after Fallout 3 and subsequent games? That is a hard question to answer, so I decided to instead see if I could find patterns in the myth and how it grew within the community through the years. To do so, I needed to find a site, some sort of forum or message board that has existed long enough and had enough traffic that I could follow the trends of Fallout New York City posts, and the best candidate for that was Reddit. In a very scientific manner, trust me, I'm a professional, I looked for claims of New York's absolute destruction through time by counting the number of threads that asked about or addressed this issue in some way. I then made note of all the comments from these threads that make a claim that New York was destroyed, obliterated, glassed, a crater, whatever euphemism people may use to communicate that New York no longer exists. The first mention of New York being completely destroyed was only a few months after that very first comment that I found on the Nexus that mentions New York as a crater. But there was only one single comment that entire year on Reddit. 2014 also only had one mention, but things would start to ramp up in 2015, which coincidentally is the year that Fallout 4 released, and there was increased speculation of the game taking place in New York prior to Bethesda confirming it would be in Boston. The trend over the next several years increases to its peak in 2020, and although there are overall more people talking about New York City being destroyed so far in the 2020s when compared to the 2010s, it has come well off of its 2020 peak. I wasn't just satisfied with that though. I also classified each of the questions or comments in 3 ways. The first are simply called statements, which are just flat out declarations that New York City is a radioactive hole. The second are uncertain statements, which are exactly what they sound like, people still echoing the refrain that New York City is destroyed, but with a touch of doubt, couching it in a way that makes it clear that they are unsure if it is entirely true, like, I would assume it would be completely destroyed or something similar. The last category covers only questions, like if someone has heard that New York City is supposedly destroyed, but they aren't quite sure and would like confirmation from the community. First, I want to look at the blue trend line, which represents the proportion of mentions that were questions, or in other words, the percentage of total mentions that were people asking whether or not New York City was actually destroyed. Discard that initial peak because of the low amount of data for that year. People seem to question this myth as it grew in popularity up to 2018. It appears the period from 2015 to 2018 represents a time when more people had heard of this rumor, but were unsure of its validity. The rapid fall in such questions in the last 2 years is also really interesting, perhaps indicating that by now there is enough discussion online that people no longer feel the need to ask the community. A simple Google search answers their questions. Now I plotted the statements in gray along with the uncertain statements in yellow, and it's interesting that they seem to be inversely proportional, or to say it another way, an increase in unsure claims corresponds to a decrease in confident claims. This trend really only breaks down over the last few years, where it seems we have more people certain that New York City is obliterated, and more people that are unsure but think that it might be obliterated. It's also interesting to see an overall upward trend for people making confident but false statements through time, whereas uncertain responses have no general trend at all. For one last interesting point, I numbered how many responses were given a correction, where someone correctly reminded whoever stated that New York City was a glowing crater that nowhere in the lore does it confirm that, and the whole thing appears to be a fan myth. Corrections are non-existent until 2016, peaking in 2017, and have an overall downward trend over time, seeming to spike when the overall number of people talking about New York increases, which makes sense. I also think it's interesting, there seems to be somewhat of an inverse relationship with corrections and people unquestioningly posting that New York City is annihilated. But it does seem as though corrections were on a general upswing until 2024. And I think there is a reason for that. Just as it seems that we are on a general downward trend for people claiming with certainty that New York City is a smoking ruin, a recent Fallout 76 Expedition expansion changed everything. For so long, the forces of knowledge have battled the forces of the ill-informed, letting everyone know that it is not stated or alluded to anywhere that New York City is a giant crater, only to have a very easy-to-miss addition to the lore come along. And a Soltron that had been reprogrammed with the personality of the thirstiest showgirl that has ever showgirled was made available as an ally, which in Fallout 76 is a sort of companion that can be recruited to stay at your camp, usually with unique missions attached to recruiting them or unlocking a unique perk that only they can grant. Adelaide, the Assaultron, has one such mission where the player must help her recover a missing traumatic memory, and upon doing so, in addition to becoming a very willing participant in human-robot interfacing, she will tell the player something explosive. I will let her do the talking though.
A shining star shooting across the night sky from Atlantic City to Broadway, or wherever New Broadway is since the Big Apple is a big crater.
Wow. Can you believe it? After years of hearing people call New York City a crater, being corrected, and battling it out in the comments, Adelaide says it. She says the thing. She literally says that the Big Apple is a big crater. This isn't hearsay on her end either. In later dialogue, she tells the player that she wanted to perform on Broadway so badly that she made the trek from Atlantic City up to New York City herself to try and join Broadway, only to discover, well, it's not there. She mentions that the bright lights of Broadway that she had heard about were actually the bright lights of atomic detonations 20 years ago, and she was apparently forced to return to Atlantic City empty-handed. There doesn't seem to be a way to spin or interpret this to mean anything other than New York City, or at the very least Broadway, and possibly Manhattan itself, where Broadway is located, is one or many giant craters. This seems to be an instance of a fan theory taking hold and becoming so prevalent that it wraps back around and finds itself becoming part of the official canon. The thing about this too is that a statement like this is likely not a mistake or slip-up, as Bethesda had in the past asked Obsidian to remove lines in Fallout New Vegas during the game's development that directly stated that San Francisco had been completely wiped out sometime between the events of Fallout 2 and New Vegas. Bethesda wants to keep options open. With a design document existing for a Fallout game set in New York, Bethesda likely has an idea for what they want New York City to be like in the post-war USA, and we will have to wait patiently and see. But it's also true that all or part of Manhattan could be a big old crater, and all the lore and hints that we've been drip-fed over the years are still true. It's all about threading the needle. With all that said, I have a theory as to why this entire fan myth turned canon thing happened in the first place. Well, really it's more like a recipe that requires several ingredients, some of which we have already discussed and some that still bear mentioning. There is a general understanding and acknowledgement that New York is a very culturally and financially important location for the United States, with an enormous population, and that means, intuitively, it would be a very desirable target for enemy nukes. It does make sense that such a high priority target would get more nukes sent their way, since more bombs means a higher overall chance of completely destroying an important location and denying the enemy any benefits from it. Therefore, many people with no knowledge of in-game lore, if asked how they think New York would have fared in the Great War, assume that it was absolutely hammered by Chinese bombs. So for most people, the myth is already very believable just right out of the gate. And this is borne out by the extremely prevalent comments like this, where people just suppose New York City is destroyed, and understandably so. I get it. Additionally, a fairly prevalent sentiment across many forms of media, including movies, TV shows, and video games, has been a general exhaustion of New York City as a setting. This is especially prevalent for media that depicts New York being partially or entirely destroyed, or taking place after some apocalyptic event that took out much of the city. In fact, some sources have counted the number of movies that depict New York being destroyed, landing at over 60 films, which is more than double any other city, with Los Angeles and Tokyo being a distant second and third place. And Tokyo gets those numbers because of Godzilla. By my count, around 14 games also fall into this category, with games like Red Alert 2, always gotta mention that game somewhere, Crysis, The Division, or even the Wolfenstein series. This exact sentiment was expressed in many of the threads and comments as I was doing research for this specific myth. Many people expressed that New York City is overdone and overrepresented in media, and that they wish to see a different city or part of the United States, and this comment is just one of many that express this sentiment. It is easy to see how a logical conclusion like New York being destroyed and a desire to not see a Fallout game take place there could lead someone to defend headcanon rather than seeking out and acknowledging lore. This comment was the best example of this phenomenon. At the time of posting, the new lore from Fallout 76 hadn't been added, so canonically, New York is a crater was still just a myth. Someone states that New York was completely destroyed, and when someone challenges them to back that statement up with lore, they completely pivot to the logical but non-canonical conclusion that New York would be a high priority target and therefore be completely destroyed. That's not how evidence works, but okay. In addition to many people being tired of New York City as a setting, there are many Fallout fans who are tired of East Coast Fallout games and want to see a return to the West Coast. Since Fallout New Vegas released over a decade ago now, and was the last time we had seen that part of the country. Therefore, these fans would have a bias against any East Coast setting, especially one as talked about as New York, and one that is apparently heavily considered by Bethesda. This is one such comment that expressed this exact sentiment, and how the initial bias against an East Coast game leads them to uncritically justify the position that New York City just doesn't exist. Because if New York is gone, well, you can't make a game where there is no one and nothing. And no, Bethesda, that's not a challenge. Please don't do that. We already had a game with no one, and well, yeah. So let's mix everything together and bake this cake real quick. Start with a hazy memory of the one snippet from the Fallout Bible that talks about New York, that a nuclear plant went supercritical and had a partial meltdown causing the hot summer. Details aren't important though, just remember New York, nuclear meltdown, hot summer. Now add being a normal human, which can be hard sometimes I know, that comes to the logical conclusion that such an important city would be a high priority target and therefore wouldn't receive any mercy during an apocalyptic showdown. Add a pinch of lore that describes New York as gone, and having been one of the first to be impacted, along with Pennsylvania, from the Fallout 4 tutorial, along with an overall general lack of confirming evidence that New York actually exists outside of a potential mention from a Brotherhood holotape in Fallout 4 mentioning the presence of tall buildings between DC and Boston. Roll in a general exhaustion of New York City as a setting, pour a cup of preference or bias for the West Coast over the East Coast, and I can absolutely see this cake starting to take form. For a fully finished product, bake our concoction in an internet that is awash with comments on sites ranging from Reddit to YouTube, along with some prominent content creators passing off these claims uncritically, and we have a fan canon that no amount of fact-checking will ever fully stamp out. And eventually, it will live long enough to become the villain and become official canon. As just a cherry on top of all this though, there was no shortage of comments that railed against Bethesda for having retconned the fan theory that New York was a crater, well at least while it was still only a fan theory. This is what can make it difficult to discuss lore online, because you can't retcon a rumor. That's not how that works. You retcon lore, not a fan theory that is the result of a game of internet telephone. That's like me getting mad that Bethesda retconned my human Deathclaw hybrid baby that was born shortly after Fallout 2 while traveling with Gorus, don't ask questions, by not acknowledging it in Fallout New Vegas. And perhaps this hints at another smaller layer or ingredient in this myth cake, that some people would more readily believe and repeat a fake Bethesda retcon over actual lore, because it's easier to accept something wrong, but that you want to believe, than to dig through and find out the truth. Finding accurate lore and speaking with precision should be important to all of us fans, and so I want to encourage any and all of you to contribute to Fallout's body of lore online, especially for Fallout 76, which is woefully underrepresented on Fallout wikis. I also want to encourage everyone to use the fairly new, independent Fallout wiki, which won't drench your computer in ads and is a great fan-hosted wiki, and that would benefit massively from any of you that would like to contribute. Check out the wiki link in the description. A huge thank you to my incredible supporters. They are the fissile material that powers this channel, and if you would like to join their ranks on Patreon or YouTube, it would be a huge help in growing Adam's Kingdom. A special welcome to TSK Lego on Patreon, and to George Hutter, Pytek, sorry I don't know how to say that, and Yuri Baker on YouTube. And of course, welcome to all those that rejoined recently. As always, a special shout out to the top tier patrons: Acrid B, Gardner Minshew Simp, Dommy Double, Tapey Poopy, thanks for helping with the footage by the way, Juan Vader, Good Old Welshire, Braden Daniel, Tyler Eaton, Owen Balzer, Ann94, Tessa Storm, Unky Nick, and TSK Lego. Adam is pleased. Take care of yourselves. Adam needs his mighty servants. Walk in his glow, and I will see you soon.